Yeah. Welcome to the talk this morning. My name is Samantha Lewis. I need to work out how this works first. Okay. I teach here at the British Council.
Okay, so welcome. Are we good to go?
It's a bit of playback. I teach here at the British Council Teaching Centre in Somosaguas. I teach young learners and teenagers. And I'm also involved in writing materials for teenagers and young learners with Cambridge University Press. And I also write some of the content for the British Council Learn English Teens website, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. So I do have a particular interest in getting teens using as much English as possible in the classroom. So obviously a lot of the ideas there are forming the basis of today's talk. That's a little bit about me anyway. I'd like to find out a bit about you. Are you all from Madrid? Yes. Does everybody here come from Madrid? Has anybody come from outside Madrid? Where have you come from? Wow. Has anybody come further than all the way from England? Okay, so that's quite a distance to come. We've also got people watching on the live stream, so certainly they'll be watching from lots of different places as well. Okay, and how many of you are teaching in private language schools or academies? Okay, and in secondary schools? All right, and primary schools? Anybody from primary? Okay, so we've got a bit of a mixture between private language academies and secondary schools. Okay, I've seen you looking up at the slide here, thinking, what's all that about? We've got this phrase here, into nice art. We're not going to be talking about art as such, unless, of course, we're talking about the art of speaking. But what we're going to do is have a look at these letters and rearrange them to come up with a word which is more relevant to our teaching context. So just to begin with, I've got a little game for you. I'm going to show you a slide. On this slide, there are a series of words written in different colours. Okay? And what I'd like you to do is to say not the words that you see, but the colours that they're written in as quickly as possible out loud. Okay? You ready? Okay, off we go. Okay, how did you get on? It's more difficult than you would think, isn't it? And I mean, there's a reason for that, because what you're actually doing is using both sides of your brain at the same time. So you've got the left side of your brain saying the words, which is often easier for most of us, and then the right side of the brain processing all the colours. So you've got this conflict going on, which makes it quite challenging. But it is a good activity if you're looking to wake your students up on a Monday morning, get them ready for learning, or perhaps to focus them on a Friday afternoon. You can do a little activity like this at the start of the class to get them focused. Okay, now let's think about our students, our teenagers, and when it comes to getting them speaking in English, I wonder how many of you can identify with this? And this takes me back to when I first started teaching. I didn't have any training, no experience at all. And I was teaching French teenagers in the UK. And I thought I would just be able to walk into the classroom, suggest a topic. Everybody would have something to say. Everybody would participate. We'd have this lovely discussion. And of course, it wasn't like that at all. And I found it very, very difficult to get them speaking, and saw that there are lots and lots of problems getting teenagers speaking and keeping speaking in English in the classroom. So we're going to put ourselves in their shoes for a moment, just to sort of think about some of the problems that are out there. Okay, and the first letter in our mystery word is I, and that's for I remember a time when. And I'd just like you to think for a moment about a time where you tried to communicate in a language that isn't your own, okay? And for some reason, communication didn't quite go according to plan, okay? And think about why. What would have made communication easier? And if you're sitting next to somebody, if not, if there's somebody behind you, if you'd like to just tell them quickly what happened. So, why was communication unsuccessful? What happened, and what would have made it easier? Okay, so just 30 seconds to remember a time. Okay, I'm going to stop you there. I certainly remember when I first arrived in Spain, and one of the things I dreaded doing was going to the market. Because you turn up at the market, there's no formal queue, just lots and lots of people standing around the market stall, and you have to say in a big voice, who's the last person in the queue? ¿Quién da la vez? And I hated saying that because I always used to say it wrong. I thought people weren't going to understand me. And then when I actually got to be served, I didn't know the word for quarter or half or three-quarters, so I just used to order a kilo of everything, regardless of how much I wanted or whatever it was. And I was certainly lacking confidence. My pronunciation was a problem. The vocabulary, not having the right vocabulary. I imagine the stories you were telling each other, probably similar things happened. Maybe you didn't have the right functional language or grammar, or sometimes even the right cultural knowledge or contextual knowledge. But certainly one of the most, the biggest difficulties with speaking is the pressure of real time that's happening now. You haven't really got time to think about it. So obviously our students are feeling a lot of those feelings as well when they have to speak in class. Plus, they've got the added problems of peer pressure and not appearing cool in front of their classmates, etc., etc. Okay, so what we're going to do now is, I thought it'd be quite useful, N is our next letter, for natural speech production, just to take a very brief look at what happens when we speak in our own language. And there are sort of various models of natural speech production flying around. They're all very, very similar. And they are basically broken down into 4 stages. So when we speak in our own language, the first thing that's going on is this idea of conceptualization. We're planning our message using our knowledge of background or discourse to help us. And then we formulate our message, what we're doing, choosing the structures, choosing the words, choosing the expressions that we want to use to convey our message. Then articulation, so there we're using all our speech organs to produce the sounds to make our message audible to the listener. And then finally this stage of self-monitoring and repair. So in our own language, if we begin a sentence and it doesn't quite come out right, we go back and start again. Or if we say a word and we don't quite pronounce it correctly, we repeat it. And for us as language learners, as language teachers, it's interesting to see that all of this is happening automatically and simultaneously, very, very quickly. We're not even conscious of this happening. But obviously for our learners, every single stage is a far more conscious process. So if we can help them with the different stages, hopefully we can help them to become more automatic in their speech production. So our next letter is T, and that's for teaching communication strategies. So again, I just have a couple of questions for you to think about with the person next to you. What are communication strategies? If you had to define what they were, what would you say? Why are they useful, and can we teach them? Okay, so just 30 seconds to discuss that with the person next to you. Okay, does anybody have a definition of communication strategies? What do they mean to you?
Techniques.
Techniques, uh-huh.
To explain your message better to an audience.
Okay, good, yeah, techniques to explain your message better, uh-huh. They're almost like sort of little tricks, set phrases that we can use to fill in those gaps when we don't have the exact language, so to fill in those gaps in our interlanguage. So extremely useful, particularly in the initial stages of language learning, because there are so many gaps in our interlanguage. So, ways of talking our way around a word when we don't know the exact word, or asking for repetition explanation or clarification, all of that kind of language is extremely useful for our learners. And can we teach them? Well, obviously, I believe we can teach them. It's not something that we do from one day to the next, but it's a case of sort of introducing them and gradually coming back to them over and over and over again and making them part of the learner's routine language in class. Okay? So, moving on, I've got a few sort of communication strategies here. And again, with the person next to you, decide which ones you use when you speak in a foreign language. Hi, if you want to try and find a handout somewhere, are there any spare handouts? That's okay. That's okay. Okay, does anybody here think that they use all of them at some time or other? Or more the purple ones or the green ones? Okay, well, they're written in two different colours, not just to look pretty on the slide, but there's a reason for that. The ones written in purple, as you will notice, I mean, what's the connection between those ones? Okay, the ones written in purple really we could term as reduction strategies, so ways of sort of perhaps avoiding saying what you want to say, certainly sort of favoured by learners who are perhaps anxious of making mistakes, who value accuracy over fluency. I mean, there is a time and a place to use these strategies too. The pretend you've understood even when you haven't is one I do find myself using quite a lot, and you're kind of nodding and smiling and thinking the whole time I haven't got a clue what you're talking about. But if our learners do over-rely on those sorts of strategies, then they are in danger of this interlanguage fossilising. Whereas we've got the green ones, which we could term as achievement strategies. So strategies that your learners will take if they're willing to take risks with the language, they're not so concerned about making mistakes, and they very much value fluency over accuracy. So there's a very strong argument for pushing those achievement strategies in class and working on them with our students. So we're just going to have a look at a few examples now, and if you'd like to have a look at your handout, for people who are watching via the live stream, there is a photo of the handout which has been uploaded onto the page, so they can access this part of the handout on that page. And basically, we've got lots of examples of achievement strategies in the star there at the top. And what I'd like you to try and do is categorize them. So some of them we would use at word or sentence level to deal with unknown words or expressions. So these are very, very useful for our learners in the initial stages, as we said, of language learning, when there's so many words they don't know how to say. And then we've got at discourse level to negotiate meaning, and also at discourse level to manage conversations. So what I'd like you to do is to match up the examples to the different categories. Okay, you can help each other, you can cheat, copy, just give you a few seconds to do that. Are there any spare handouts anywhere? Okay. Okay. Okay, for people who are watching via the live stream, they will have to scroll down the page to find the photos of the handout. Yeah, the examples in the star you have to match up to the categories below. Okay, do we have any fast finishers? More or less? Okay, perhaps the quickest way of checking the answers to this, kind of bingo, but backwards. So if I say the category, if you call out the number, and then we'll see if we've got the same example. So for example, to use a general word, 6, okay. Relative clauses, 8, To describe the purpose or function, okay. And to use approximations, 7. And actually, all of that language we'll come back to later. It's extremely useful if you're playing games like Taboo in class, where they've got to define words, define vocabulary without using the exact word. This is all the kind of language they need to do that. Okay, so then moving on to discourse level, to show disagreement. 4, okay. Ask for an explanation. 12. To check understanding. 5, okay. And ask for repetition. 11, okay. And then finally, to keep the conversation going. 2. To react to what you hear. 10. To interrupt. 1. And to buy some thinking time. Okay, number 3, well done. All right, so what we've got there are lots and lots of different examples of strategies that you could introduce to your students. Obviously, you wouldn't introduce them all at once. You would divide them into different categories and look at some different examples for each category. So we're going to have a think now about introducing this language to students, how we do that and how we consolidate it in class. And our next letter is for exposure, exploration and evaluation. And this is a kind of model suggested by Luciano Mariani. He's done lots of research into communication strategies and how to teach them in class. And he divides it up into 4 stages. And it's very, very simple. Basically, the first stage he calls experience exposure. And what he means there is that if you're going to introduce, say, some strategies to agree or disagree, then introduce them in a context, so in a dialogue, in a meaningful context. And the students would listen to the dialogue or watch the audio, and perhaps you just give them a very general comprehension task. And then the second stage he calls observation exploration. There, some way of focusing the students on the specific strategies. So you might get them to fill in the gaps, or match up 2 halves of the communication strategies, or put the words into order. Some way of focusing them on that. And then experience practice basically is to give the students an opportunity to put that language into practice, so through perhaps an information gap, a role play, a problem-solving task, where they get to use the language. And then finally, this observation evaluation. So thinking back to when we were looking at natural speech production, that self-monitoring and repair, this is an opportunity for students to think about the language that they're using. But it is very difficult for them to evaluate themselves as they're speaking. So perhaps what you can do there is get students to listen to each other and maybe tick off the phrases that they use. So evaluate each other to kind of make them a bit more aware of this self-monitoring idea, okay? He takes it full circle. I mean, I quite like this idea of going back from stage 4 back to stage 3 again and repeating tasks, because I certainly find with my learners, the second time they do a speaking activity, they always do it better because they're not sort of thinking so much about what language to use, but how to use it. So I think there's a strong argument for doing lots of task repetition with them. So what I've got now is a short video clip, just for you to think about what language you would pull out of a clip like this to teach your students. Okay, so what language would you teach them from this?
So which films are on this evening?
Here's the programme. What do you fancy going to see?
How about Star Wars? It's a classic.
I don't really like science fiction films. How about Hairspray, the musical with John Travolta? Have you seen it?
Yeah, I have. I don't really want to see it again. It was rubbish.
Oh, okay. What else is on?
Well, there's a James Bond film on. Or Night at the Museum.
What's Night at the Museum about?
I haven't seen it, but it's a comedy.
Sounds good. Let's see that.
Fine with me. Ben Stiller's in it. He's a really cool actor.
Right. It starts at 8:30. There's time to get something to eat first.
Okay, so what kind of language could you pull out of a dialogue like that? Suggestions, Suggestions to go and watch a film, choosing which film to watch. Okay, and you actually have it in your handout, but you can sort of see how the activities follow that idea, that model. So the first activity that they do is they watch the dialogue and they choose which film they're going to go and watch. So a very, very general task the first time you introduce the students to the language. And then in exercise B here, they would focus on the specific phrases that appear in the dialogue. And as I say, there's lots of different ways you can do that. Here they've got to match up the two halves, but you could give the words in the wrong order and they've got to put them in the right order. They could categorize them. They could fill in the gaps. Some way of drawing their attention to the language. And then here, the exercise C, they've got an information gap activity where they have to put that language into practice. And what we'll have a look at as well is how to encourage them to use those phrases when they're doing an information gap activity. So it might be a case of they get a point every time they use one of the phrases, or they have to pick up things from the table every time they use one of the phrases and try and get more points than their partner. Some way of encouraging them to use the phrases. And then finally, this idea, if you wanted to move into peer evaluation, while students A and B were carrying out the activity, you can have another student with the phrases that they have to use who listens to them and ticks them off as they're carrying out the activity. And obviously then you would rotate and they would evaluate each other. Okay. Our next letter is R, and that's for routine language. And by this, I mean sort of the language that we use every single class, regardless of what we're doing. So if you're doing a vocabulary activity, they might be saying to each other, what have you got for number 1? Well, I've got such and such. What about you? Me too. Well, not me. All of that kind of language, I think, is quite useful to introduce because that gets used on a daily basis. And I mean, certainly in my case, in my experience, you know, the classroom is very sort of limited time that our students have to speak English. They don't speak a lot of English outside the classroom. So we really need to find opportunities to maximise how much they're using in class. Okay, this kind of language often gets introduced perhaps in course books in Unit 1. They might have a little focus on some classroom language. How do you spell such and such? What's the meaning of such and such? But there are other ways that you can introduce it too, and I think there's other sort of areas of language that you can introduce that are quite useful to students as well. So we're going to have a look at some different ways of introducing language. First one I've got here is a running reading race. Is everybody familiar with that idea for an activity? I mean, it's a kind of just glorified dictation, I suppose. But if you had some language here that you wanted the students to introduce to the students for them to use, basically what you would do is divide your students up into groups, maybe of 5 or 6, and you would stick the cards with the language you want to introduce to them around the classroom, far enough away that they can't read it. And then each student in the group takes a number, and they take turns to run up to the wall where the card is, read the first line, remember it, run back and dictate it to their group, and everybody writes it down. So it's good for their memory as well because they have to remember what they've read and dictate it. They're thinking about spelling as well. And they all take a record of it because they all have to copy it down. And then student 2 runs up, remembers the next line, reads the next line, remembers it, runs back and dictates it. I mean, not just for this, you can use this kind of thing for any activity. And the students really enjoy it. It can get a bit chaotic, but once they've done the activity a few times, they know how it works and they do quite enjoy it. However, not everybody has enough space in their classroom to do something like this. So a solution to that is to have backs to the board. So get your students, instead of running around the classroom, just to work with the person next to them. One of them sits with their backs to the board, and the person looking at the board or the screen dictates what they can see to their partner. And then their partner can read back what they've got, and they can check and see, and they can sort of correct each other. So that's another way that they're introducing the language to each other. Or another technique which I like to use, the teacher is a CD player, which I'll show you in a moment. So the first idea, this idea of backs to the board, okay? Can you work with the person next to you, and one of you turn your back to the board for a second? Okay, so if you could turn round, one person. And the other person, I'm going to show you a series of words or a series of phrases that you could teach your students when they need to keep talking and buy some thinking time. And I'd just like you very quickly to dictate those words, those of you who are looking at the screen, to dictate the words to the person who's not looking at the screen. Okay? So, are you ready? Okay, let's see how you get on. Okay, you get the idea anyway. I mean, it's a way of introducing language to students. You could use it for questions before a reading task or a listening task. I mean, you can use it for any kind of activity. And then this idea of the teacher as a CD player, are you familiar with this idea as well? Basically, you transform yourself into a CD player or an MP3 player, and the students give you instructions. It is just a glorified dictation, but they do enjoy it. And the students have to write down what you say. Okay, so we'll have a go at that. So basically, the instructions you can give me are stop, play, and rewind. Number 1, I can't see the board. Number 2, what does that say? Number 1, I can't see the board. Number 2. Number 1, I can't see the board. Number 2, what does that say? Number 2, what does that say? Number 3, can you make it bigger? Number 4, can you turn it up? Number 5. Can you move it up a bit? Okay, how did you get on? Have you got them all? Okay, I mean, this is a technique you can use, as I say, again, for introducing anything you want. Maybe some questions before a reading task, a listening task, anything, an introduction before a skills lesson. And it's very good for the students' sort of bottom-up listening skills. I think dictation, but when you sort of, dress it up in this kind of way, it's very useful for them. Okay, so they are the phrases that you should have written down. Is that right? Okay, so this kind of classroom language, particularly if we're using more IWBs, more technology, classroom language obviously is changing as well that students are going to need to use. Okay, so our next letter A is for and, C, consolidate. So ways of sort of consolidating this language. We've looked at ways of introducing it to students, but they're not going to use it if they don't remember it. So you need to sort of play a few games and do a few activities to get them to use the language. So this is where I'm going to ask you now to get into 2 teams. I think the easiest way is to have people on that side as Team A, and over here Team B, although Team B does outnumber Team A quite a lot. Okay, and basically I have some of those phrases on these cards, so hopefully you wrote them all down. And the rules are the first team to shout out the correct answer the loudest wins the point, okay? So who's going to win, Team A or Team B? Team A. Okay, yeah? Okay, you ready? Okay, that was Team A. Well done. Come on, Team B. Okay, well done over here. Can you move it down a bit? Okay, well done over here. Okay, so we have a lot of visual learners over here. Another thing you can do with these, they're flashcards for a reason. You could just flash them at the students. So, you ready? Okay. Okay. Or show them upside down. Uh-huh. Okay. Or you could get them to lip read what you say. Okay, so. Okay. Okay. Or for your auditory learners, you might decide to tap out the rhythm. So, for example. Okay, well done. Or you could hum it to them. Da 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 da. Can you turn it up? Okay. Or you could begin the phrase and they have to complete it for you. So, can you turn? Okay. Or for your sort of more kinesthetic learners, you could get them to mime the phrases to each other. So, have a go at miming one of those phrases to the person next to you. Mime one of the phrases. Okay, but they're just sort of ways to consolidate the language, help students to remember it. You've got a list of those games as well in the handout. There's a few more suggestions, and I'm sure you can think of many, many more ideas as well yourselves. Okay, so moving on now, there were the phrases, is ways of now encouraging students to use this language every single class. So some sort of reward schemes I find work quite well. What I find works incredibly well, particularly with my younger teens, is this idea of using marbles. And they work in groups. Usually they sit on tables in groups. And I give each group a coloured pot. And when they use English in an activity, I just give them marbles. Okay, so they collect marbles throughout the class. But if they speak Spanish, I take the marbles away. And what this actually does is create a bit of peer pressure between them as well. So it's not you having to say all the time, can you speak English, can you speak English? Because if one of the students loses a marble for their group, they start to tell each other off and say, no, you've got to speak English, you've got to speak English. Then at the end of the class, depending on how many marbles they have, they get a certain colour sticker. So if they don't get very many, each class you can decide on your scale, they might just get a red sticker. Moving up to a yellow sticker, and finally the big prize, the green sticker. Very, very simple stickers. There's nothing special about them, but they do really motivate them, and they don't like leaving class without their sticker. So it's one sort of reward system you can try with students. I also give them marbles if they've done their homework, or if some of them, does something quite well in class, or offers some information to the rest of the students, just anything, but certainly for their use of language, use it for that. For older students, perhaps they might find marbles a bit babyish, and stickers. You could set up loyalty cards with them, so if they get a certain number of points, maybe they get a stamp for each class that they've used English in their groups, and when they've completed the card with however many stamps, they can trade it and they can get to choose the song you listen to, or they can get to choose a game or an activity. So again, sort of putting the emphasis on them, motivating themselves and each other to use language. Okay, and then this idea of language menus as well, because I think part of the problem of them not using the language is that they can't remember it. So it's a case of having it very visible. So you might have posters on the wall, but I quite like this idea of, for each category of communicative language, this is interactive language, so asking each other, what do you think? Do you agree? Do you think that's right? Or here, sort of the audio-visual language they need. And that can just sit on the table in the middle of the group, and they've got it there all the time. They can look at it, and I think some students need that support until it becomes automatic. Or it could just be a case of having it at the back of their course books, just glued into the back of or the front of their course books, so they've always got it there to help them. Okay, and another idea as well to encourage them to keep using it is ongoing assessment. So maybe a certain percentage of the grade that you give students for their speaking over the year or over the term could be for how much they use it on a daily basis, which will certainly encourage some students to up their grades by using more English. Okay, so now our next letter is T, which is for taboo and other games. Is everybody familiar with the game Taboo? Yeah? And as I mentioned before, the kind of language that students will need to use to play Taboo are all of those communication strategies in that first category when they don't know the exact word or expression. And there are lots of reasons why I just love the game Taboo, because not only are they developing their speaking skills in this way, but they're also recycling vocabulary. Are you familiar with the idea of vocabulary cards? So I get my students to make these, perhaps after a vocabulary lesson or any vocabulary that crops up. It's always on the board, so they come up and they tick off a word each, and they go away and they make a card. So they have the word on one side, and they might have the picture on the other, or they might have the word on one side and a definition. And basically, these obviously build up over the weeks, and I just for each class, keep them in a bag like this. But they give you an instant warmer at the start of class. You can give each student a word, and they could play Pictionary, they could mime the words to each other, they could play Taboo, as we said, with them. Sometimes I get them to make up stories as well. They have to look at the cards they've got and make a story using the words and incorporating them. So, not only are they recycling vocabulary, but they're also, if you play Taboo, developing their communication skills as well. And other games, and the great thing about it is as well, the students make the cards, so it's no preparation for you, which I'm always in favour of, students doing a lot of the work. And this is a similar game. You're probably familiar with this tic-tac-toe or noughts and crosses, so in pairs. They take turns until one of them wins. So how do you adapt this? Again, minimal preparation, but you could just fill in the squares with something that relates to, or words that relate to the topic that you're dealing with in class. You can get the students to suggest words to go in each square. And then the way they could play it is if they can talk for a minute without stopping about a particular square, then they get the square. So using all of that language that you dictated to each other about to keep talking and buy yourself some thinking time, they could put into practice as they played a game like this. Okay. Moving on, our next letter is I, for images. Images are a fantastic way of getting students talking. Course books are full of them. You don't have to just use them for the purposes they were designed for. You can get students to imagine the conversations going on in the images, or imagine what they can see beyond the image in a course book, or describe them to each other, and the other student has to find the image they're describing. Lots of different ways you can use images. And obviously, with mobile phones, everybody's carrying around images all the time. Has everybody here got their phone with an image gallery? Okay, so what I'd like you to do, for example, another way of using that language to keep talking and to buy some thinking time, I'd like you to take out your phone and choose an image and just talk for a minute without stopping to the person next to you about your image. Okay, so if you could take out your phone and choose an image that you are prepared to talk about. And this is an activity as well you can use with students if they're allowed to take mobile phones into class. because everybody has an image gallery with images they can use. Okay, and this is some of the language again that you might encourage your students to use as they were talking to each other about their images. Okay, I'll let you carry on the conversation in the break. We're very, very close to the break now, so you can finish off telling each other about your pictures then. Just moving swiftly on now to O, which is our next letter, which is for online resources. So particularly thinking about all those resources and tools that are online to help develop speaking. There's lots of stuff out there, particularly if you're thinking about developing more sort of this self-monitoring and students self-evaluating, using online voice recorders, getting them to record themselves and listen back. Here's a few resources that you can refer to. They're all on the handout, but basically they're very, very easy to use, lots of them. Just uploading photos and students then record their voices onto them, so you can set sort of a homework task as getting them to speak about a photo, or maybe it's something you can do in class. Blabberize, that's quite fun because they actually draw a mouth on the photo and then they speak and record their voice and the mouth is moving on the photo as they speak. Moving down, got Audio Pal, Brain Shark, which is a bit more formal. Perhaps if they had a document, more project work, or a PowerPoint, they can add their voice to that and record that. And then just a couple of places, Larry Filazzo's blog. He's got lots and lots of links to lots of resources. And you're probably familiar with Russell Stannard's teacher training videos with excellent tutorials to use all of these different tools. And on the Learn English Teen site, there's a lot of help to prepare students for speaking exams, some ideas to help them there. Okay, so our last letter is N, which brings us on to the very last part. We started with this phrase, into nice art. I'm sure everybody by now has worked out what the mystery word is, but just in case you haven't, and also to see how creative you are, I'm going to give you 30 seconds on the clock to see how many other words or phrases you can make with these letters. Okay? So, you have 30 seconds. Okay, so what was our mystery word? Interaction. Okay, and how many of you came up with other words? Any phrases? Did anybody come up with any phrases? How many words? 5? Any more? Okay, well, I came up with a couple of phrases. You can rearrange your letters so I eat tin corn. Or this one as well, acne knit riots, which given we're talking about teenagers is probably best not to think about. Okay, thank you very much for listening. And if anybody would like to get in touch, there's my email there. Okay.